Welcome to Better Together. This is our YouTube channel where we're hosting conversations to help us think more deeply about the unity of the church and to inhabit the postures of a church that can live in unity and mission together. Better Together, for those of you who don't know, is a movement of members, leaders, pastors, and churches throughout classes in the Christian Reformed Church that are calling the church to live a mission-focused, baptismally based identity that actually allows for disagreement on matters that do not directly determine a person's salvation. So that is what we are about. My name is Kyle Brooks, and I'm a pastor in the Christian Reformed Church, planting a multiracial church here in Oakland, California. I happen to be a member of the steering team of Better Together. We're hosting these types of conversations to inhabit the postures of a united church. And we're trying to do that in a way that models what that could look like for us as a denomination, it sounds like an audacious thing to say, but we're trying our best to live that humbly and graciously. And that's part of the reason why I'm so excited to be talking with James K.A. Smith today, who will be my conversation partner. James, or as sometimes goes by Jamie, is a professor of philosophy at Calvin University, where he holds the Gary and Henrietta Biker Chair in Applied Reformed Theology and Worldview. Really, how I understand the work that you've been doing for the last number of years, maybe well over a decade now, is translating philosophy for the church and helping the church think more deeply and nuanced and using the tools of philosophy to do that. And I don't know if that's a fair translation of what you're doing, but
that's great. That's exactly how I think I understand my work. And a lot of my colleagues in the philosophy department, we talk about philosophy as a way of life, and we're trying to sort of bring the toolkit of philosophical intentionality and offer it to the church. So no, I'm happy to be described in such a way.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Well, I mean, for those of you watching, you probably know some of Jamie's work. Maybe you've read some of his books. Desiring the Kingdom is a favorite of mine. I feel like it's a classic in the understanding of a worship theology in the Reformed tradition and an Augustinian tradition. Full disclosure, I'm a little biased towards some of your work because, I took a class from you on Augustine City of God, which I sometimes joke with my friends was it should have been titled Desiring the City of God, because
absolutely. You in a way sat through the first draft of what became the book Awaiting the King, my book on public theology, where Augustine looms again large. So thanks for being a guinea pig.
Hey, always happy to be a guinea pig for you. One of the most recent books the most recent book you've written or published is How to Inhabit Time: Understanding the Past, Facing the Future, and Living Faithfully Now, which I loved. It was
Thank you so much.
It's such an unusual book in a really amazing way, in that it's some deep philosophy, but it's also very deeply personal. You write about some really formative and even traumatic experiences in your own life and what you've processed in doing that. So maybe I would love to start there. Why did you approach this book in a different way than some of your previous books?
Yeah, thanks for recognizing that. It is a bit genre defying. It's not people don't know exactly where to put it on the shelf, because on the one hand, as you say, I'm trying to bring the resources of Christian philosophical reflection to our spiritual lives. On the other hand, I'm trying to invite people into that in ways that I hope are more attuned to the imagination and the heart, and not just processing ideas with our head. And so I think that's part of the reason why there are slices of memoir, you could say, that characterize part of the book, and that's kind of reaching people on the register of testimony, which is, a form of story that St. Augustine modeled, but that sense of, I hope, writing in a way that has vulnerability that then feels like an invitation for people to become vulnerable in their own kind of encounters with God and what they're living through.
Oh man, that's so beautiful. And yeah, I remember as I was reading it thinking, oh, this feels very Confessions-esque. Uh,
Yeah. I think Augustine really sort of models that, and in many ways, as you know from the book, in some ways, it was my own spiritual journey and therapeutic journey that got me thinking about these questions of how time is an arena of our relationship with God and an encounter with God. And so it grew out of that kind of personal experience. I mean, the book is also, as you know, kind of operating on two registers, because on the one hand, it's like, how does God meet us across the seasons and time and history of our lives? But it meets us individually, but it's also about this kind of collective reckoning with our past. And so part of the backstory of the book is also, quite honestly, seeing a kind of national reckoning that was occasioned by the murder of George Floyd, seeing how people responded to that in terms of grappling with legacies of injustice in our country, or not reckoning with those legacies, and being a little unsettled at how flat-footed and naive Christians in particular could be about the way in which we kind of inherit pasts that project us into a future. And so it's probably, the book is probably a bit greedy in trying to work on all of those registers, but I thought it was worth a shot.
yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if greedy is the right word for it. I think, and as I was reading it, I was like, yeah, it makes sense that in order for us to reflect collectively as individuals, we would have to do that self-reflection already. Like,
Yeah,
I mean, it would be part of the work to be really deeply
yeah,
honest about the things that we've gone through personally and the ways in which we
yes,
like kind of, I think, use the term thrownness. Was that from Heidegger?
yeah.
Um,
I'm from Martin Heidegger. That's right.
we have to be.
Geworfenheit is the German.
Ooh,
If anybody wants to impress friends at a cocktail party on the weekend, Geworfenheit. You just start talking about thrownness. Yeah.
oh my goodness! Impress friends at a cocktail party, but I wouldn't impress my wife if I pulled that one out.
No, exactly.
Oh man, yeah. So I mean, is that part of? I mean, as we're thinking about the work of Better Together, a lot of it is how can we have this collective conversation. But if I'm hearing you right, one of the things your book is doing, and am I right to think that one of the ways you're encouraging us is in order to have that collective reckoning, we also have to do the work of having personal reckoning.
Absolutely, and I think I mean this reflects something about what it is to be creatures. That is, um, in a sense, every creature is a microcosm of a larger community of which they are a part, and we cannot be human apart from community. We are made for that sort of social web of relationship. But on the other hand, each of us has an individual story, and we worship a God who knows the very number of hairs on our heads. It's fewer, and God has to do a lot less counting for me these days. But there's that absolute intimacy of the way that we are seen and known by God is, of course, so unique and crucial to the Christian imagination. But then our stories, our microcosmic stories, also are caught up and play out in larger collectives and communities. And so, I think, especially, this is exactly the why I think testimony is one of the ways of thinking about this. Right, when you share your testimony with me of how God has been faithful to you, how you've had to reckon and wrestle with God. Um, in a sense, I will never replicate your story, but you sharing your particular story does become part of a model, a template, an occasion, and a catalyst for me to start looking at my own story
Mm.
gratefully, vulnerably. And if we then are all collectively doing that, we start to develop the habits and practices that enabled us to have hard conversations about our institutional legacies, our collective pasts, our communal hopes for the future. And I think it's natural that we sort of toggle back and forth between those two levels, so to speak.
Part of what I'm hearing you say, I think, Jamie, is that listening is a crucial component. Listening to even the individual stories of others is a crucial component of the collective reckoning with when we are and what history
Yes.
inherited, and how
Yes.
we can move forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I do think, as you point out, in some ways, for me, to try to understand what it means to be faithful in time as historical creatures, I do think probably the really catalytic moment of that is this moment where we sort of confront our histories and face our past, and that will often be experienced as a kind of reckoning.
Yeah.
But to do that, you're absolutely right that in many ways it requires me, even on a personal level, to sort of kind of shut down all the stories I have usually been telling myself,
Mm,
to make myself available to hear the still small voices that the spirit has been whispering that I just kept squelching and wasn't, willing to hear or didn't want to hear. And so I think even on an individual level, I have to learn to listen to the whispers of the spirit that I have been sort of covering over. But
mm,
then on a collective level, I think that reckoning requires this posture of listening precisely because collectively and communally, and we say, when we say this collectively, right? Like you can think of almost a kind of one of those sort of Russian doll sets of, I mean, in some ways, the massive collective is something like the nation, right? Do you know what I mean? And that's a communal and collective reckoning that has to happen. But it can also be a congregation.
yeah.
It can be a university. It could be, right. There's different sort of shapes of this, and I think one of the things that we realize is that in many ways the story we have told ourselves about our institutions and congregations and denominations and nation is only some people got to tell the story.
Mm,
And so
mm,
it was a rehearsal of some particular story, and we sort of squelched and suppressed uh, um, people who also were living the history
yeah.
but didn't have the sort of space or permission or power to be able to tell their version of the story. And I think especially for I don't want to sound um too predictably sort of, well, will just say in my particular case,
Yeah.
I think it's very easy that sort of white men generally get to tell the story. Like most of the institutions I've inhabited, the history has been recounted by people who look like me, and I need to shut up for a while
Mm,
and listen, and to see, oh, there are facets of our collective story that I've never grappled with because I just kept talking all the time.
yeah. Yeah. It is a bit ironic that then we have two white men here just talking for an hour.
We start
but
where we are, right?
but
That's right. But
we have
you're
to
right.
we have to start where we
Absolutely.
are. And this is also, I mean, these types of conversations are opportunities, I think, for us to listen and to rehearse other parts of the story that we've been given the privilege of listening in on.
Yeah,
So yeah,
exactly.
I really appreciate
And I
that.
try to do that in the book in a way too, right? Like like there's a sense in which the voice of a James Baldwin or a Gustavo Gutierrez or these other kinds of voices that you might not expect in a typical book on theology, philosophy, and spirituality. You're trying to sort of listen to these other voices.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard that coming through loud and clear. I I wonder about, as we've been talking about sort of the importance of listening, you name a few things in the book, a few maybe postures toward time that seem to me to be sort of um, postures that shut down our capacity to listen because they try really hard to just map everything onto a predetermined, predictable pattern of relating to time. So in the book, you talk about nostalgia and
Yeah.
doomsdayism, and
Yeah.
also the sort of idealist view of progress. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how do you see what are those relationships to time, like nostalgia, doomsdayism, and the idealist view of progress, and how do you see those postures playing themselves out in the church today?
Yeah. This thanks for that question. So yeah, for me, what we're talking about when we're trying to imagine and understand what is it to be faithful as creatures who are historical, right? This is I think an essential facet of the way God made us as creatures. Our creaturehood is temporal. We live in time, we dwell in history. However, um, there are kind of rightly ordered ways to inhabit time, and there are disordered ways to inhabit time. And I think one of the forms of, say, a disordered relationship to our past looks like a form of remembering, which is part of a faithful. I mean, if think of what the church learned so fundamentally from Israel is how and why remembering the faithful acts of God is actually part of our ongoing journey, right? So memory is crucial to a faithful way of being. Um, but that's very different from what I call nostalgia, which is nostalgia is now not just a remembering of the past, it is a kind of romanticizing of a particular and edited version of the past.
Yeah.
So the problem with nostalgia is not that it remembers. The problem with nostalgia is what it forgets.
Uh,
And nostalgia gives you this kind of romantic, uh, um, photoshopped, airbrushed version of some sort of golden age when actually everything was good and true and right, and we were, in. And now the impulse is to just kind of claw our way back
yeah.
to that golden age. This is a very, very, very powerful temptation for religious communities,
Mm.
um, and I think it's also a very powerful cultural narcotic right now. I think there are so many things about, recovering some time when we were great. And the fact is, what happens is you paper over and conveniently ignore all the ways that it was terrible for a lot of people is one part of it. And so it's a form of, it's the selectivity of the remembering that is the problem, and not faithful,
Yeah.
right? This is where the
Yeah.
Psalms are so
Yeah.
different. The Psalms are so honest about remembering not only the highs but also the lows in some ways, and being honest about them. Now
That reminds
there are
that
yeah,
I
please.
just jump in real quick, and it reminds me. I was preaching this week on Acts 2:42 through 47, right? Which is this very idealist sort of picture. If you just take those 5 verses on their own of the early church, and you hear lots of church planters like myself, like, we're going to be like the early church, we're going to be like the early church. But then you just forget to read the stuff about Ananias and Sapphira. You forget to read the stuff where the Hellenistic Jews, or the Hellenistic widows, were being overlooked in the distribution of food, like
Yes.
on a racial basis, and like how messy the life of the church actually was, and how Luke was faithful to record not only the sort of summary, like, okay,
Yes.
large view, this was beautiful, and there were
Yes,
there was some
exactly.
mess in there that we need to just like be honest about and reckon with.
Yes. The book of Acts is not hagiography,
Yeah.
right? Like you see all the ugly stuff too. And that's a crucial gift, I think, because it also gives us a sign and a signal of how God can use messed up people like us. And it shouldn't surprise us that we continue to grapple with those things. I mean, one of the forms of nostalgia that has a particularly distinct American expression is also what we could call revivalism.
Mm.
And revivalism is basically this story we tell ourselves that we had it right in the first century. And then God kind of left the building for hundreds and even thousands of years, and then somebody in 1828 or 1906 or whatever, they sort of recovered the truth and brought it back, and now we're in the club that remembers it. But it's a way of actually spurning the faithful acts of God's Spirit in all of the intervening centuries. And I think it's a really, really destructive, nostalgic way of being. But you also asked about the sort of disordered forms of being oriented to the future, and I
Yeah.
think these are equally um, problematic and disordered. So, for example, one form of being oriented to the future that's disordered, we could call doomsdayism, is how I call it in the book. We could just say it's a form of despair,
Yeah.
actually, right? And interestingly, for St. Thomas Aquinas, despair is almost the root vice,
Huh.
because it cuts off any possibility of being able to hope for and imagine a world differently. And I think that we need to revisit that. That's not the same as saying that people who struggle with depression and mental health and find themselves despairing because of situations, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking almost about like a kind of committed way of imagining that the world is only ever going to get worse,
Yeah.
right? This kind of doomsday. And a lot of religious people can be inclined to that too. I think the great sort of I hesitate to say it's scare quotes, maybe one of the sort of secular forms of a disordered orientation to the time that we inhabit today is um, a very kind of naive, what I would call progressivism,
Hmm.
where now you just imagine that on the basis of our ingenuity and purity and willpower and moral standing, that things are just going to get better and better and better because we are the ones in charge.
Yep.
And that's a pretty captivating story for a lot of people today. And I think I don't think that is the same as being hopeful. I think
Yeah.
hope
Yeah.
is a way of being oriented to the future expectantly, but not because it's driven by an engine of confidence in our own ingenuity or ability, but actually because of our dependence on a God who is faithful, who is catching us up in what God is doing in the world. And I think
Wow.
so. Hope and faithful and grateful remembering are the forms of kind of inhabiting time and remembering well and looking forward well. Those are counter to these other sorts of forms of disordered inhabiting time, of
Yeah.
which there are many more.
I hear how hope would run counter to the doomsdayism, that sort of sense of despair, like that commitment almost to despairing about the future and its possibilities. And that's a really interesting point, how it runs counter also to this simple, idea of progress, this up and to the right.
Yes.
Because that isn't actually hoping in God at all. It's optimism in ourselves and our own ability. It's sort of that you want to be on the right side of history sort of mentality when we're having
Yes.
difficult
Yes.
conversations.
Yes. And it's a bit of a, it comes with, I think it's not surprising when it is sometimes attended by a certain kind of almost fundamentalism of the left, you could call it, where now um, we are the ones who've got it all figured out, and we can't imagine how anybody doesn't agree with us.
Yeah,
And
right.
so it spawns its own sort of intolerance. Interestingly, I think that intolerance is often the outworking of a certain kind of shame, which is people
Mm.
become ashamed of the people they were earlier when they didn't get it, or they didn't, they weren't with the program. And now they're kind of embarrassed of that and they're ashamed of that. And so it's almost like their intolerance to anybody who hasn't yet caught up to their enlightenment is sort of their own refusal of the people they were, which is why it's often very fraught, I think, and emotional. Um, and
Wow.
it's because it's a hard place to dwell in.
Yeah.
Um, And so we kind of want it all or nothing in that sense. I mean,
Yeah.
if I can say one more thing, I think what's also significant about hope versus optimism, or hope versus just this kind of like, confident progressivism, is hope is also characterized by a kind of waiting, right?
Mm,
It's not
yeah.
we are active, we get caught up in what God's doing in the world. I know Walter Storff's work, the sense that God's shalom is the vision of what we are longing for, and now our labor is caught up in trying to bring about foretastes of that. But it's still characterized fundamentally by this sense of an active waiting, where you realize the fullness of these things are gifts to be received, not programs to be engineered by us. And I think that sense of waiting feels scandalous sometimes in our cultural moment in which we find ourselves.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because I think one of the things I've noticed in this ecclesiastical conversation about,
Mm,
like, well, if we disagree about human sexuality, is it even possible for us to be united? There can be a real sense of despair about that. That's that's reflective of a certain reading of an orientation to the past as well, right? That
yeah.
it's not so much a nostalgic view of the past that somebody in this frame of mind might be bringing forward. It's actually a sort of almost mechanical view, like, well, whatever has happened before is going to happen again. And because we haven't seen very many good models of denominations that have been able to hold together, churches that have been able to hold together with different opinions on this particular issue, therefore, we despair of a future together. There isn't a way forward. And so we might as well cut it off now and stop wasting our
Mm,
time, stop
mm,
waiting,
mm,
because there's nothing to wait for. I think
mm,
that's something I've been hearing quite a lot of, and I think it's something that maybe people from either side of the aisle, if there is only two sides, which we know there aren't, but if there were, I think people from either side of the aisle would feel a sort of weight of that, like, we haven't seen this work well in the past. What hope is there for a
yeah.
denomination like
Yeah.
ours?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. That's really well said. I hadn't thought about the way in which this sort of despair of imagining a feasible, messy future together is the outworking of um, a kind of impatience, right? It's actually the working out of a certain kind of impatience. We can't see how these things could be held together, and therefore we should rend them asunder because it's clear that they can't, rather than imagining, well, what would it look like to wait and try to be a people who, because of our, as you put it, our baptismal identities of God and Christ reconciling the world to himself, because it is the resurrection realities of God's redeeming of the cosmos that binds us. Maybe we could sort of live with some patience with respect to these other things. I think that's right. I mean, I think what worries me about the state of our denominational conversation, to take one obvious example, is precisely that both sides, so to speak, could be caught up in different forms of these disordered aspects of temporal orientation, so to speak.
yeah.
And I think one of the things that's really puzzling to me is the way in which um, I think at the very heart of the Reformed tradition and of the Reformation was actually a deep sense of the continued grappling with God's Spirit in such a way that we expect to ongoing sort of wrestling and wrangling and listening and hearing anew and refreshed, so that reform is kind of built into our DNA because we have the sense of God's covenant faithfulness with the people of God across time, and we know that time is not flat. Time is not, history is not just a sequence of tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, and everything else is the same. No, the things change because of time.
Yeah.
That's true in our own lifetimes. I mean, I don't know any mature believer who thinks that they are the same person at 55 as they were at 15.
Mm.
And yet we ironically imagine that the human race or an institution doesn't sort of face a similar journey, adventure.
Yeah.
I think we have fallen into sort of confusing faithfulness with preservation of forms that we know.
Mm.
And I think it's short circuiting our openness that characterizes us in other places of our adventure with God. I think.
So say more about that. I want to double click on that for a second. You talked about faithfulness, the idea of faithfulness as preservation, something you talk about in the book as well. If that's not the way to understand and frame faithfulness, then what is? What's the way that Christians can frame faithfulness going forward in their journey with God?
Yeah, yeah. So um, this is complex. So let me try to work this out a bit.
Okay.
So to come back, without question, faithfulness is characterized by a kind of remembering. That's a given, right? And why? Because both as individual creatures and as communities, we only are and can be who we are because we have actually received gifts from our past, right? Every single one of us individually and every institution and community collectively is what it is because it has received and been the beneficiary of legacies that have been handed down, and that past makes it possible for us to be. So without question, we are to be sort of grateful for the gifts that have been handed down to us. That's part of faithfulness. It's why traditio, right? Tradition. There is no faith community that is not traditioned, because traditio means to hand down, right? This has been made possible. However, the point of the community handing that down to us, the tradition handing that down to us, is not so that we keep our necks craned backwards and try to reproduce what's been handed down. The whole point is to launch us into the future with the gifts that God is giving us so that we can be faithful in the present and going forward. And
Mm.
so, in that sense, I don't think faithfulness is primarily defined by
Mm.
a preservation or a repristination or a protection of forms or whatever it is that we've received. It is a grateful reception of the gifts in order to discern
Mm.
what is the Spirit calling us to right now.
Is it almost like the parable of the talents with our tradition? Like our tradition is
Go
what.
ahead, Mr. Preacher. Lay this out. I want to hear how you're saying it. Yes.
Well, as I'm hearing you talk about this, I'm hearing you talk about our tradition like the master gives his servants these talents that Jesus talks about, right? This parable that Jesus talks. The
Sure.
master gives his servants
Sure.
talents, and there are a couple of servants who, okay, they take those talents, that gift that they receive from the master, and they invest it, and they build it, and they grow it for the master, so that when the master comes back, they have something to say, hey, look what we did with what you gave us. And we wanted to build on what you gave us. We saw that as our responsibility. And there's another servant who says, oh, let me just keep it, preserve it. I don't want to lose what the master gave me, because if I lose it, so there's this like fearful orientation toward the future. Like if I don't preserve this, then he's going to be upset.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so there's a sense of
I see.
not being willing to risk, not being willing to, yeah, it just strikes me that
That's great. No, I totally get it.
is a parable of the talents. I mean, it's Jesus saying, hey, you're supposed to do something with what I'm giving you.
Yes, I think that's brilliant. There, and it shows how I think it actually brings to the surface the way in which the kind of faithfulness as mere protection and preservation is operative because of a fear that actually governs our way of being. Right. So there's a and I think that's very psychologically and emotionally real for a lot of us, and so we retreat in some ways to the safety or the known of protection and preservation, rather than casting out and venture rather than stepping into the adventure that the master has given us the gifts to undertake, which comes with risks, right? And the risks are inherent in that. I think that's well said. Yeah, that'll preach, as they say.
Sweet. I'm gonna take a note on that and work it into. Yeah, but so it's not a preservation of the past. It's not a preservation of what we've been handed down. Then what is it that we need to do in
Yeah,
order?
so it's I think now faithfulness hinges on discernment. And what are we trying to discern? What we're trying to discern is how, given the gifts that God has given us, given the mission that has been handed down to us, and given the vision of the kingdom that animates us, what does it mean for us and for us collectively as the people of God to live out our image bearing calling,
Hmm.
to be faithful to this God who is, a promise keeping, covenant keeping God, and for who, by the way, is eternal and unchanging, the same yesterday, today, and forever, but also knows that we are not.
Yeah.
Right? That's the mystery of the incarnation, is precisely that the eternal God keeps covenant with creatures who inhabit time and
Hmm.
are given to change and transformation and unfolding and unfurling. And so what we're trying to do in the present is to discern, what does it look like to bear God's image for the sake of the world, in light of what we know of God in Christ and the scriptures, in light of the sort of kingdom missional orientation that's been bequeathed to us, and um, being attuned to the now in which we find ourselves. I think this is the piece that we struggle with, and I get it that people are like, oh, now this just sounds like a recipe for doing whatever the world is doing. The irony I would say is that, in fact, as I see it, and I'm not trying to be controversial, but I'll just say, editorializing, this is not Better Together. This is just some rando named Jamie saying this. Uh, um, I am struck by the way in which the kind of fearful retreat to preservation and the desire to sort of purify, to me, looks exactly like the working out of a cultural zeitgeist that is all over the place, which
Hmm.
which is nostalgic, which imagines that we can sort of separate the wheat and the tares, and it's up to us. And I actually think it is a mistake for those given to preservation and protection projects to imagine that they wear the mantle of faithfulness and immunity to time. I think in many ways they
Hmm.
can also end up playing out what are just wider the zeitgeist. We should just appreciate that itself can be a reflection of the zeitgeist. What I'm talking about is, it's not just catching up with what the world is saying. I have zero interest in that.
Yeah.
Instead, it comes out of this deep conviction that when God calls creation into existence, first of all, time is created at exactly the same moment, right? And so when creation is called into existence, time itself is birth. And in many ways, that creation that God pronounces as very good is not finished.
Hmm.
Do you know
Hmm.
what I mean? Like we
Yeah.
we we confuse the very goodness of creation is not at all synonymous with the fullness of what that creation was made for. Because the clue and signal of the fullness that creation was made for is revelation,
Yeah.
is what the prophets are,
Yeah.
are telling us about a world of shalom looks like. Well, the only way that this very good creation is going to get there is time, history. Now,
Yeah.
it's also going to be grappling with the brokenness of sin, which sort of befell the world, and the reality of God's incarnation in Christ. But in some sense, I think a very good creation needs time and history to actually realize all that God wants to see unfurled and unfolded of creation's possibility and potentiality, which is exactly why time makes a difference. When we are, makes a difference. And it's, yes, there is a certain way, from the book, I do meditations on the book of Ecclesiastes at strategic moments in the book. And yes, it is true in a sense that there's nothing new under the sun. But there is also a sense in which uh, um, every generation lives in a new world. Every generation inhabits a new context, and that context is a new arena for mission. It's a new opportunity for us to listen to the Spirit and say, okay, what are we called to, given the eternality of God, the covenant expression of our mission, and the now in which we find ourselves? What does it look like for us to be faithful, and what does it look like for us to be patient,
Yeah.
and hope? I think all of that makes for what I see better together, bearing witness to, which is a very humble, um, messy, but hopeful, communal grappling with God's Spirit. And I think that, to show the world that the church could be that, would be an incredible witness of what God can do in people.
Wow. Yeah, I agree. And I want to go deeper a little bit on something you said there, because I
Okay.
think, I mean, there's a lot that you said that's important there, but something in there that is just, I think, so important for us as we're having these types of conversations. Um, you talked about how what God gives us in creation is good and not finished, and therefore meant to be developed in time. And therefore, that means that investing his talents, so to speak, does not mean that what he gave us was bad to begin with or
No,
insufficient to begin with.
no.
It reminds me of that passage in Luke. I think it's chapter 4, might be earlier, might be chapter 2, where Jesus, it's kind of come to the end of his childhood years, and Luke is transitioning into his adulthood, and he says, and Jesus grew in stature and in favor with God and with man, or with human beings. And that is just like a mind-blowing idea that
Yes.
that the
Yes.
perfect human, who was created without sin, born without sin, completely perfect, grew in stature and in favor. I think the Greek word there is grace, um,
Mm, mm,
and with human beings. Like, the perfect one grew, and it's like that C.S. Lewis, like, further up and further in the last
yes.
battle, right? Like
Yes.
that. And I think that that's important to double click on a little bit, because I think that sometimes my impulse to preserve, is also an impulse to protect the righteousness of what I had before, or the goodness of what I had
Mm,
before. Um,
mm,
and,
mm.
and I've seen it play out in a variety of arenas. It's like when a child grows up and decides to make some different decisions than maybe their parents would have made for them, and and the child sees it as, hey, I am applying everything you taught me to my
Yeah.
life, and the parent sees it as, like, you're rejecting what I taught you because I
Right.
wouldn't do that same thing. That it might not be a rejection of our past to
No.
develop our past into the future.
It could be a grateful reception of it as exactly the launching pad that with which we could not have cultivated the gifts that we have.
That's right.
Exactly. So there can, right. So this can never be characterized by a kind of spurning of what has gone before, because in fact, what has come down, what has gone before, is it's the archaeological layers on which we can stand, and without them, we're over the abyss.
Yeah.
It's exactly why I have very little patience for a kind of um triumphalist, progressivist, we are so much smarter than Paul, or just like a kind of dismissal. I mean, I've been thinking, so it's a little dangerous for the philosopher to talk about the Bible with the pastor, but in that same spirit, a couple of Easters ago, I was sort of blown away by, so this is John 16, upper room discourse. Jesus is speaking to the disciples and says, I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. It's such an interesting, so, and the setup here is really, really important. I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. Now, first of all, I think it's incredible that the incarnate God recognizes a temporal moment, right? That's the incarnate God saying, we're in the now. And at this point, you don't have the capacity to receive gifts I want to give you in the future.
Yeah.
I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. And then is precise. It's a very beautifully Trinitarian passage, because he goes on to say that, of course, to promise the Spirit, and the Spirit is going to lead us into all truth. Yeah. Now, there is no way that promise is fulfilled at Pentecost, because it's not like at Pentecost all of a sudden, all right, well, we've got all the truth. Should be pretty smooth sailing from here. Because no, you get Acts 10, Acts 15, Acts 18. Do you know what I mean? In other words, that's the beginning of the church wrestling with its legacy, wrestling with what it is, the gifts it has received from Israel. What does it look like for us to be faithful going forward? I just think that promise that Jesus has many things to say to us, but we cannot bear it now, is exactly why time is a gift. It's exactly why history is one of the gifts that God gives us. And to me, the expression of Catholicity in our tradition is this deep sense that the Spirit has been active and living and speaking and guiding and convicting over millennia, which is why we have gifts to receive from the whole history of the church, right? We're not just leapfrogging back to the origin. But it's also why we expect and we can live confidently but humbly into a future where we don't have it all figured out. We're like, God, what do you need to do in us so that we can become the people whose now is ready for the next gift that you want to show us or share with us, and that's true of our personal lives too. But I basically inhabit that promise as the heart of what it means to faithfully inhabit time.
Oh my goodness, I gotta sit with that for a second. That is beautiful. What kind of people, what kind of postures do we need to inhabit to be the kind of people who can faithfully live now, the gifts that you are going to give us, even as we move into the future? I'm gonna rewind that when I watch this again, because like that, and like it's somewhere it's gonna find its way into.
I'm glad it might be helpful.
So I know we're coming up to our time, but I want to ask some, like, a really practical, like, ask Jamie to put on his like Nostradamus hat for a second. As a person who,
first of all, when you said practical, I'm like, dude, I'm a philosopher. I don't do practical. Yeah. All right, let's carry on.
Well, I know that you're a student of culture, and you're a student of the church and of the happenings of the church. And so if we're putting on our hopeful, grateful orientation toward time, when do you think we are as a church? Maybe you could take it as a denomination in the Christian Reformed Church for this conversation, or you could take it as the church in America writ large. And we're thinking with an eye especially toward these conversations around sexuality and others where we have significant disagreement. When are we?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm going to risk just spitballing, because I don't want to overstate my confidence in a take on this. All right, because I think there's a lot of parts of this that we could work through, and I would want to hear others. Right, like one of the things that strikes me is that um, let's talk about the Christian Reformed Church. All right, let's think of it on that register. One of the things that I worry about and I puzzle over is that I actually think we find ourselves in the fraught space that we are after, I would say, a generation of not receiving the gifts of our Reformed tradition. In other words, one of the and I should say, I'm kind of an immigrant to this tradition. First of all, you might notice my last name is Smith. I'm a Gentile. Do you know what I mean? Like I as George Marsden used to put it at Calvin, I am not one of us.
It's
So
not Smithsma or DeSmith.
no, it's not. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
But I'm a committed immigrant to this tradition. Like it changed my life. Like it literally changed how I see God. And by the way, my wife Deanna, who has been an elder in the Christian Reformed Church, would say the exact same thing. Do you know what I mean? Like just incredible gifts. I have been puzzled at the ways in which it seems like our denomination has not been gratefully receiving the gifts of our own tradition, and instead has been sort of like mimicking um, forms of Christianity that I think are just kind of associated with either with a kind of generic evangelicalism in the United States. And so that I actually don't think we are a tradition that is drinking from our own wells right now. And I think because we're not drinking from our own well, and by the way, I would also say and just to be candid and fair, I think Calvin University, where I teach, we might be part of the problem here too. Do you know what I mean? I think that we, in some ways, as an institution, we have also not adequately. I think our department in the philosophy department has always been really committed to this, but I'm not sure that as a university we are. And so what happens is precisely when we need, I think, the sort of intellectual, spiritual, and ecclesiastical gifts of our distinct Reformed tradition, we're actually managing a Reformed denomination, but with the tools of outside kind of habits of mind. And so I think there's a disconnect there. I think that's part of it. Yeah. So we actually, what worries me is I don't know if we are the kind of people right now who actually know how to do this well as a Reformed community, because I think we have spent 40 years being something else. So that worries me a little bit. And but those wells, I'm not despairing, because those wells haven't dried up. We just need to start sending our buckets back down. And I think if we could, I see an opportunity for renewal and revitalization. I'm also seeing it. I will say, as somebody who gets to sort of be out, meeting folks like you, talking at different kinds of churches and stuff, I would say the parts of our tradition and community and denomination that I think are the most energetic are actually those missional edges of our denomination that see the gifts of this tradition and are bringing them to new Christians and new communities who then also see them for what they are. By the way, I think a lot of these places are in California. And in that sense, I think if we position ourselves in the midst of the energizing missional edge, where we're not just replaying Midwest politics, but we are actually living out mission for a world that knows so little of Jesus, I think that changes the stakes of how we have these conversations. And Yeah, I don't know if that's a very I certainly don't think that's a very astute analysis, but those are a couple of things that kind of stand out for me a little bit. In addition to the earlier point about I'm really kind of saddened by how much we are mirroring the zeitgeist rather than challenging it. And I think that's kind of it's really, to be honest, it's some days it manifests for me as anger, but that tip of the angry iceberg is mostly a profound sadness. Like it's because I thought we were somebody else. I thought I was joining a different sort of community, and what we're doing right now is just like, oh yeah, I've seen this. I know how this plays out. I thought we were different. So the sadness, I think, is understandable. The trick is how to be sad without being despairing, and that's what I'm trying to talk myself into.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, and I resonate with it. As a fellow
I'm
immigrant,
sure.
to the CRC, I mean, part of what drew me in was this this beautiful, sacrificial, covenantal way of having hard conversations that I had read in synodical reports of all things, you know, and coming from my own history, a little bit more of a reactionary style of doing church.
Yes. Same.
It was
Same.
beautiful to me. It was beautiful. Like, wow, we can have these conversations and go back and forth over years patiently,
Yes.
and
Yes.
to a
Yes.
place that is not practical from the standpoint of butts in the seats, churches in a congregation, but faithful. And that's what
Yes.
drew me to this denomination. And so I share your sadness and the way that it looks like this conversation is being had at the moment. But I want to ask you before we go, and you alluded to this a little bit. I want to ask you, what hope do you have as you look at the challenges we face in the church today?
Yeah. I mean, I mean, honestly, what you guys are trying to do with Better Together gives me hope, because I know that you are a configuration of a conversation within our community that isn't like treating these things either flippantly or as matters of salvation, and so you're willing to dwell with one another. That gives me hope. Um, Honestly, like um, I go to a local CRC church that is exploding with 20 somethings. Do you know what I mean? Like if you want to ask me what gives me hope,
Hmm.
um, for me, it's very, very close to home, because I see what is our Christian Reformed Church? It is a community staked on practicing the resurrection of Jesus for the sake of bearing witness to God's grace and justice in a way that is, I think, fundamentally trying to be humble about how much we think we have figured out. And what gives me hope is um, people are drawn to that, like genuinely. Like it's crazy how our congregation is awash in young people and older people across generations who are really kind of animated by this mission, and we being reformed is really, really important to us. Like we're this is not some success that comes from being generic. It's actually from sort of leaning into who we are. And so that uh, makes me more. I'm more hopeful if I look closer to home, which I guess look for hope where you can find it. Right. I mean, ultimately, I'm animated by a sense that God plays a very long game, and I think this is exactly part of our reformed tradition that we've forgotten. As we discussed earlier, I think the moment in which we find ourselves, you put it so well, I'm worried that our denominational sort of powers that be are characterized by a fundamental impatience.
Hmm.
There's a deep, deep impatience. I think our tradition, going back through Kuyper and Calvin and all the way back to Augustine, is fundamentally the articulation of a patience that grows out of a hope that rests in the promises of God. And I think if we could learn patience, we would that's a faithful expression of being dependent on God's love today. That let's not miss the missional opportunity of being that kind of a people.
Wow. Patience that grows out of a hope that rests in the promises of God. I want to leave it right there. That is a call. That is a call that I can
A
own
place,
my own life, and
yeah,
I really hope it's a call that we heed as a community as well.
yeah.
So, Jamie Smith, thank you for joining us.
Great to chat with you. Thanks so much. Thanks for the thoughtfulness of what you all are trying to do. Grateful for it.